Hello, and welcome to today's webinar titled Gain Visibility and Enforce Security Policies for Assets Across Public Clouds. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items to keep in mind. First of all, today's webinar will be recorded and will be made available on demand shortly after today's broadcast. Secondly, anyone from the audience may ask questions during today's live broadcast by clicking the questions button on the right-hand side of the BrightTalk web application. We'll save about 10 minutes at the end to answer any questions. Finally, the slides from today's presentation are attached to this BrightTalk webinar page in case you may be interested in revisiting these on your own time. Now let's get started. My name is Ryan. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing at CyCognito, and I'm pleased to be joined by our guest speaker today, Aviel, who's a Product Manager at CyCognito. Thank you for joining us today, Aviel. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much for the intro. Hi. Thanks for everyone seeing this right now or in the future. Again, thank you for joining us. We'll be talking about some interesting things, obviously cloud migration, visibility, security posture, and basically everything that comes in between. A quick intro about myself. So I'm Aviel. I'm from Tel Aviv. I have been working in the security domain, specifically cybersecurity, for the past 10 years, either in product management or in hands-on cybersecurity. Sometimes it's more about cloud transformation, cloud migration, and cloud security, and some other domains as well. So this is a thing that I really believe in. This is something that I think would be very valuable. And obviously, if you have any questions, as Ryan said, there's the Q&A section at the end, so feel free to ask anything. Let's get started. So this is our agenda for today. We'll be starting with cloud computing in numbers. This is the main part, right? Because obviously, when you want to talk about cloud computing, you need to understand what's the scale of the problem, what's the scale of this phenomenon called cloud computing. Which is something that entered our lives approximately 10 to 15 years ago. But obviously, in the last 7 to 5 years, it's much more concrete than it was before. Later on, we'll be talking about some questions in terms of cloud security and cloud management and cloud computing in general, and the fact that some people say that more assets on the cloud, meaning that it's less secure for an organization. Some of you may think it's correct. Some of you may think that it's not directly correct, and obviously, something in between. And the last part will be some kind of, let's say, guidelines of creating a cloud visibility plan, something that you can understand and comprehend in terms of creating a concrete plan for cloud visibility, making sure that you can have something that will be useful for you to understand your situation in terms of cloud security. And let's get started. We'll be starting with cloud computing in numbers. Let's get started with the general market share of cloud service providers. I think this is something that is super interesting. It's not super surprising, by the way. Because as you can see on the right side, there are 3 big players that are dominating the global cloud market: Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud. You can see some other interesting players there. You can see Alibaba Cloud and Tencent that are Chinese players. You can see IBM Cloud, which is also a big vendor in terms of cloud service providers. And you can also see 2 players that are not, traditional players that you'd expect to see here, like Salesforce and Oracle, which are usually perceived as, specifically platform as a service or even software as a service providers, and not specifically infrastructure as a service, but they do have those services as well at some level. So this is very interesting to look at. And obviously, you can see that the revenue in Q1 2023 was a bit over $63 billion, which is huge, right? This is something that you can see that the growth of this from Q1 2022 to Q1 2023 was over $10 billion. This is amazing. And obviously, we can understand from this that the cloud transformation is no longer something that companies dream of. It's something that companies are doing on a day-to-day basis. And I assume that most companies and most of the people listening to this today have something in the cloud. It can be some of your, environment. It can be all of it. It can be even just a very small portion of it. Again, depending on your industry or needs. But you're probably familiar with what I'm talking about. Second part is something that takes this, cloud usage and getting a bit more complexity into it. Multi-cloud usage. So 85% of organizations indicated that they deployed applications on 2 or more infrastructure service providers. This is from obviously February 2023. Maybe it's even bigger today. It can also reach 90% very soon, from what I understand. And this is very interesting because it brings a lot of complexity, right? So, 20 years ago, you had mostly on-premise, right? It was relatively easy. Sometimes you had some stuff hosted on ISPs, but generally speaking, it was relatively easy. 5 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, most companies had one cloud provider or cloud, infrastructure provider. And today, most of the organizations that are, relevant to this indicated that they have more than 2 actually providers, and this is great. This is very interesting, and it brings, as I've said before, a lot of complexity. On the right side, you can see the reasons why our company actually doing this. So the first 3 ones are interesting because you can talk about performance and flexibility, reliability, storage, capacity, and such. These are things that obviously come in mind, right? On the right side, you can see some other stuff that are relatively less common, but still there. Geographic location requirements, avoid vendor lock-in, for example, retain mergers, cost flexibility, and such. These are things that are, they come in hand. But the interesting part is actually on the left bottom side. You can see that something is called shadow IT led to multi-cloud usage, which is very interesting, right? So let's talk a bit about shadow IT and what is shadow IT. Generally speaking, shadow IT is the phenomenon of people in an organization or someone in an organization having an IT system, software, platform, whatever, server that is not officially managed by the organizational IT, but it's still being used by someone or even many people in the organization with real data in it, right? It's not like someone is creating a machine just for testing stuff that have no meaning to the organization and the IT. It's actually something that is meaningful. Someone is doing something with it. And that's interesting because you would assume, and I would assume as well, that if there's someone in the organization that is having some sort of a machine in some sort of a cloud provider, and it's a shadow IT machine, meaning that it wasn't something that was approved by the IT department, and people are starting to use that, I would assume that the IT manager or security manager or someone would stop this and say, okay, listen up. We have an IT department, only use those and, only use their systems and that's it. But what actually happens is that a relatively large percentage of the companies are, instead of, stopping this from happening, or actually endorsing it and acknowledging it as something that will happen and already happened sometimes. And basically they're saying, okay, shadow IT happens. There is no way for us to stop it. This means that, we are doing multi-cloud, if not officially, but we are there because we have a system and it has our information in it, and it's on a cloud environment that we don't support, but we need to support because this is ours. So this means that they acknowledge it, and the percentages are very high. So this is something that is super interesting from my perspective. Some food for thought, actually. And the next part that I wanted to talk to you about is the complexity that we are bringing in. We talked about multi-cloud usage, which is great. But now I want to talk about the specifics of why is it complicated? Why should I care if I have 1 or 7? That's fine. So first of all, technically, it's complicated. Right? So you have your IT team, maybe 20 IT teams, but you have a certain amount of people managing those environments from a technical perspective. And as long as you have one environment, it's relatively easy. You go to Amazon Web Services, you take some kind of a course, some certifications, and you know what's going to happen, right? You know how to manage it at some level. Obviously, some things come with your experience, but that's okay. But Then you have Microsoft Azure. Now you need to know about 2 environments. And now you have Google Cloud, so you need to know another one. And there's another one and another one. As you have more environments. This means that you spend less on each of those and you gain less experience. But on the other hand, you need to know more. So it kind of like pulls you from both edges, making it very technically complicated and very hard to manage from the knowledge perspective, the technical experience perspective. So it's very hard for security teams to manage that much. Sometimes you have a dedicated team for each cloud infrastructure, but obviously not all of the organizations have the resources to do that. The second part is that logistically, it's complicated. And this is one of the main reasons that we're talking about it right now. Because obviously, let's think of, I don't know, someone that wants to go out and start fetching all those assets and writing them down. It's really hard. It's really complicated because, most of those cloud environments have different accounts, and sometimes those accounts have other accounts inside of them, and they have machines and services and such. So it's very hard to keep track of what's going on. And, those 2 reasons, with the fact that it really differs dramatically between different providers, make it very, very complicated. And these are things that maybe you are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. Maybe not yet, but you will experience that. This is life. This is what happens. Obviously, some companies have it harder and some companies have it easier, and that's fine. It really depends on the amount of resources that you have and the experience of your IT or security people, which is great. I hope that everyone would have, not experienced those pains, but I assume that you will sometime. And, those pains potentially start helping us understand what risks arise, because obviously when you have new challenges, you have new risks that may be created. So one is something that I think is very interesting. It's the cloud services configuration difference. So let's assume that you have 3 cloud services. Let's say top ones, Amazon Web Services, Azure, and GCP, Google Cloud providers, Google Cloud Platform, sorry. So let's assume you have 3 of those, and you want to migrate one instance, one virtual machine, one cloud, whatever service from one to another, right? Or from one to 2 others for redundancy, for example. So if you can just drag and drop it, it would be easier, but it's not the case, right? Sometimes you have software to do that. Sometimes you need to do configurations and such on the cloud level, but also on the machine level as well. And the configuration between different cloud providers, it's not apples to apples, right? It's apples to oranges. This checkbox that you have on AWS, on Azure, it may be a configuration file, which is totally different. It acts differently and behaves differently from the architecture level or from the feature-specific tactical perspective, but this is different, right? It's not like you have the exact same checkboxes that you check on both of the platforms. So the configuration is different, and even if you really want to have it, with some kind of parity, sometimes it's just impossible, and this leaves you either at risk because you misconfigured something or just can't configure something correctly, or leaves you overprotected, which sometimes it's good, but sometimes it hurts the business. This also leads to unwanted services and data exposure. These are things that we're seeing on a daily basis. As CyCognito is an external attack surface management platform, we're seeing those unwanted services being exposed on a daily basis, specifically on cloud, because someone just moved something from one cloud provider to another and just have no idea how to do it correctly, and stuff are getting exposed on almost a daily basis. And these are stuff that we constantly see. The third part is the security policy and compliance, right? So as I've said before, most of you are security managers, security engineers, people that have a security policy, and you need to make sure that everyone and everything is compliant with that. And it's sometimes it's just not impossible. It makes it very hard. So obviously there are many more risks. We don't have much time. If we had like 9 hours, maybe we can talk about most of those, but we can't. So let's continue. Cloud migration risk case study. This is actually something that happened a few years ago, actually a year and a half ago. This is a customer that I've worked with, obviously the names and the specifics of this case study are redacted and obfuscated, so you cannot infer who is it and why. So no worries about that. But this is something that actually happened, and maybe you have experienced something similar as well. So let's talk about it. So there's company X. It was a customer of mine. And they were using AWS, Amazon Web Services, as their infrastructure as a service provider, right? They didn't use too much complicated services, just infrastructure. They had some machines, and they uploaded those machines and installed some servers on them. That's it. Nothing too complicated. A few months after launching it on AWS, they had some problems in terms of industry compliance. So they needed to move some of their cloud infrastructure to Microsoft Azure because they needed redundancy. They couldn't rely on one vendor. They needed to avoid vendor lockout. So basically, they had to move some of their cloud infrastructure to Microsoft Azure. So far, so good. This happens. That's fine. Both of them are great providers, by the way. But there was one problem, one relatively big problem. Their IT was just not experienced with Microsoft Azure, but they had 1 month to do that. Maybe even more than 1 month, maybe 2 months. But generally speaking, they didn't have too much time to do that, right? But they needed to get it done. So they have their IT guy. He went on and did some great courses by Microsoft. They also brought a consultant to help them with the process. But, time goes by, and you need to start moving stuff, and you need to start getting things done. But it turns out that the network hierarchy and the architecture and the structure between the instances in AWS and Azure, it's very different, right? It's not like you can take 5 machines that are constructed in a similar way and just copy and paste them to Azure and everything works as expected. It's just different from the permissions perspective, from the network perspective, from routing, network traffic perspective, and obviously security controls and so on. So it's very, very different. And they tried their best. Right? So they tried to do a lot of things. And again, they tried their best. They tried to do the apples to apples comparison between AWS to Azure, and they copied and pasted the configuration, right? This is kind of like a quote because they didn't actually do that, but they tried to do their best. They did some minor adaptations to make sure that, whatever they have will keep working. And they mostly focused on the business perspective because obviously, first of all, you need to make sure that the business is running before you're starting to work on security, right? Because a lot of companies are still oriented towards business before security, which, this is a risk you are taking. And for a few months, they had one of their production servers exposed in a very, very non-orthodox way. And it was not good. It was very bad. It took a lot of time until we actually helped them understand how to take care of it, and more than that, how to have full visibility of both of those environments. And maybe some of the things that we'll talk about a bit later will be helpful to understand that. So something that people ask: more assets on the cloud equals more risk or less risk? I don't know. Well, obviously, of course not. It's not something that we can specifically say. So, sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But generally, it's a mixture of existing risks, right, with new flavors. Because, I don't know, a few years ago, you had firewalls and rules. Now you have security groups and configuration and such. So these are risks that are still in the network level or in the open closed ports level and such, and the routing level, but they have new flavors. They look a bit different, they act a bit differently, but generally they're very much similar. And some new things to worry about that we might talk about in the future. But just wanted to start with the biggest risk of all, something that's kind of like would lead us to a point where we're discussing cloud visibility. The biggest risk, from my point of view, as someone who is a security manager and helping a lot of companies, knowing what my risk was. That was my biggest pain. It was really hard sleeping when I have no idea of what's going on, right? Because if I have a risk, I don't know, some service that is exposed to the internet and has a vulnerability, but I know about it. So this is something that I can quantify, or at least, try and quantify and say, okay, this is the potential damage from this, either as, money, either as reputation, but this is something that we can understand and quantify. And if management is okay with that, good. If they're not okay with that, let's handle that right now. Let's prioritize risk and such. But when you don't understand what your risk is, it's much more complicated. And this is kind of like what happens, because cloud is an unknown risk booster, right? Because I'm trying to kind of like set you up with the environment of what's going on. So let's assume we're 20 years back, right? So we had someone that wants a new server, I don't know, some kind of a new website that we're setting up. So you were asking the IT guy, or going to his room or her room and asking, okay, hi, I want a new server. This is my approval of having a new server, or whatever. And you open the ticket, or I don't know, raised a request or anything, and there was an actual person, an IT guy, that was taking a specific server, a physical one, setting it up, connecting it with cables, setting up routing, and then maybe it was virtual, but sometimes it wasn't. And then he writes it up like, okay, this is a new server, and this is the IP that I gave it, and this is the name of it, and this is the guy that asked for it. His name is Aviel, and it was on, I don't know, 4th of July, and that's it. It happened, and he was keeping track of what's happening. Most of it, if he was responsible enough. But today things are a bit different, because the R&D department have direct access to cloud environments, so they can raise and spawn machines on a daily basis, and it's really hard to control that. Even if you do have software or permissions to control that, it's still never 100% feasible to control everything. We know that. Marketing and sales are usually working with contractors, and maybe even other departments or partners that also are capable of spawning new websites, new campaigns and landing pages for leads and such. And you don't always have the capability to track those, but it does contain information that you own at some level and you have responsibility over. IT and security are always trying to do, some kind of experiments and testing and such. And you can see that, they are working a lot. And obviously, someone in the security just tried a new server or a new service, and someone in the IT has this cool machine that is trying, I don't know, some kind of a sandbox of something, and he just pops it up, and then someone has an urgent ticket, and then he goes and handles the ticket, but then you forgot to close this machine, and someone adds a network interface 2 days later because of, I don't know, some random policy that someone had, and things happen, right? And it's hard to keep track of all of those. Even if you have some controls, it's never enough. And it's never 100%. Sometimes you have 98%, which is enough, but it's never 100%. I'm sure of that. And that takes us to a situation of pure chaos, right? This is kind of like what's going on. It's really hard to keep track of everything. I'm sure that you're not in this situation. And if so, I'm sorry. But generally speaking, this is something that a lot of security managers and compliance managers and people dealing with risk experience. And you're probably wondering, okay, yeah, this sounds horrible. We don't want to get there. Maybe we're already there, but what can we do? So next, we are going to talk about your next cloud visibility plan. Hopefully, it would help you understand, first of all, the risks that you own. Second, what's your internet-facing cloud security posture? Right? This is what we want to do. This is what we want to have. The bottom line, we want to make sure that you can understand what's the risk that you have, what's the current situation, and obviously having this as something concrete that you can rely on as kind of like the backbone of your security plan. Sorry. Yeah, so that's what we're going to talk about. Again, as Ryan said before, if you have any questions, feel free to send them out in the Q&A section later on, or just now. We'll be handling those later. So we're starting with the plan. First of all, a few things that I want to say before we start. First of all, these are not concrete things. Obviously, the world changes and companies have different needs and people have different needs. And, this is okay. These are not guidelines that are, something that is written in stone. You can be flexible, and you should be flexible because, obviously you need to make sure that you have the right capability to be flexible enough to manipulate, because obviously nothing is 100% scalable all times. And the second part is that this is not kind of like a one plan fits all. So please have in mind that some things may change between different industries and different company sizes and different teams and such. So the goals of this plan, the cloud visibility plan that you want to have, that hopefully you will have or already have. So the first one obviously is the goal, right? What we're aiming to have here. We are aiming to solve the pain of your unknown unknowns in cloud environments. Few slides before, we have mentioned that you have a lot of unknowns, and hopefully you don't, but maybe you do have. And you want to make sure that you can find those unknown unknowns and make them known knowns at some level. Second part, which is very important, you need to make it scalable and practical, right? Scalable meaning that your plan needs to support you no matter what's your business, no matter what's your business size, either in terms of ARR, in terms of number of employees, number of instances, number of machines, number of services, number of whatever you have. Because, if you need to change your plan every time you have 3 new employees in your company, it doesn't make sense. And it needs to be practical, right? Because if the plan says no asset should be exposed to the internet and you're an ISP, well, it's not practical, right? It's a joke. So you need to make sure that it's practical. It's something that can actually be done at some level. Not everything is super practical today. If your plan is asking some guy to run around the offices and ask people what are the IP addresses of their servers, again, not practical. Maybe if you have 2 offices, but that's basically it. And the third part, which is very important, you need to iterate according to new challenges and opportunities, right? Because there will be new challenges, new risks, new CVEs, new vulnerabilities, new attacking groups, new services that may be exposed to new stuff. And this makes the plan, some kind of dull, right? So, you need to make sure that you can iterate and make sure that you can track and understand new challenges and acknowledge them and sometimes respond actively to those challenges. But on the other hand, opportunities, right? So let's assume that there is a great opportunity. Let's assume that tomorrow morning there is a new, company called cloudsecurity.com, whatever, and they have this amazing product that you can install in your environment, and with one click, everything is super secure for life. And that's it. It works amazing and everything is great. This is an opportunity. You don't want to waste it, right? And maybe it's even free. I don't know. So this is an opportunity. Don't, make sure that you can understand the opportunities as well. Sorry, I jumped too fast. So let's begin with the plan itself. What is the plan? So the first one is, the first part actually, is that you need to assure that your current security policies and plans exist and make sense. I'll divide this into 2. Exists is kind of obvious, but it's still something that needs to be acknowledged. You need to have a security policy. You need to have a plan. You need to have something. If you don't have a security policy, it will be very hard to keep track of your cloud assets and understand your risk, because if you don't have a policy, you can't know what's not compliant with the policy, then you may not understand what is risky and what is not. So a plan is probably a good idea. And the second part, that it needs to make sense. because obviously if your plan does not make sense, it's not useful. For example, I've said it before, but I'll repeat. You are an ISP, and your security policy says all my firewalls need to have inbound and outbound traffic closed, filtered out for good. Like, okay, it's a great plan for, I don't know, not an ISP. It's a great plan for someone who doesn't need the internet, but you are the internet, so it doesn't make sense. So this is something you need to understand. Second part, you need to map all your existing assets, right? On-premise, cloud, and such. I'll mostly talk about the cloud, but not just. So there are two main ways to map all your existing assets, right? So you can have in-house, you can do it in-house. You can have tools, you can have systems, you can have teams of people doing just that. You have great products that can help you manage that, like CMDBs. You can do it in a spreadsheet. You can do it with internal tools. You can do it with whatever, right? But generally, you need something in-house to manage that. There is no way that an external tool can do everything for you. It's not impossible. Tools are meant to be helpful, but they can't replace people at the moment, not that I'm aware of. And the second part on top of it is external products, tools, and services. ESM obviously is one of those, so I'm a bit biased by that, but there are other tools to do that. But it is important because obviously when you do it in-house, you can only cover what you know, and sometimes you can find stuff that you didn't know about. But looking from the external perspective is very important because obviously when you look at something from a different angle, you see stuff differently and you act differently, and you can tell people different things about things they already knew about. And the third part is test number 2, the list or the group or whatever of existing assets, according to number 1, the security policy, and repeat. You have a list that is constantly changing. You have a security policy that is constantly changing. You need to coordinate between those. Have the assets, test them according to the policy. Make sure that they comply. If they don't comply, make them comply. Map again, see the differences, and so on and so on. You need to repeat. You need to make sure that you're doing that in whatever cadence. It can be daily, it can be weekly, it can be monthly, it can be yearly. Obviously, it's very different, and I can't tell you what's the right cadence because there is no right or wrong here. There is what serves the business needs and what is possible in terms of resources. Obviously, testing all your assets on an hourly basis with 1,000 scanners is practically impossible because you will not have, you will pay for your network traffic more than you have business, right? More than you get from customers. But obviously, if you test it once every 3 years, you will probably have some security gaps. So again, really depending on your business, on your organization, on your team, and on your availability and resources. And now I want to dive deeper specifically into assets. As you can see here, in number 2, we talked about map all existing assets. That is great. What are assets? So in the past, we had some assets like the IP addresses that I bought or that I leased or that I'm using or whatever. IP ranges or networks, CIDRs and such. It's bulk of IP addresses. Domains that I either bought or lease or use again, and certificates, sometimes managed by me and sometimes not, but that's okay. But generally speaking, this is the assets that we talked about 20 years ago. Today it's a bit different, right? There are some other interesting stuff like buckets, APIs. That's not that new, but it's still something that is relatively new. If you compare it to domains or IP addresses. Zero trust networks, shared hosting websites, serverless computing instances, and something very weird, machines with 20 network interfaces. This is something that I have seen in a company that I helped them, and it was a very weird instance. I don't know. It just happened, right? So, we're not talking about that. But these are things that you can see. They're weird. They're not things that we were used to see, right? So these are things that you need to make sure that you can understand how they work. Your people need to understand how those work. And you need to make sure that you have the right tools and the right cost-effective ways to understand where these lie. and how to make sure that you have visibility on those, and how do you understand what's the right security policy, and if they don't comply with security policy, what's the risk. So these are things that you need to know, and if not, then start doing that. This is knowledge that is very important. It's a bit too much for this specific webinar, but this is something that I highly encourage you to start talking about. And you probably are, API security is something that everyone is talking about, but still have in mind. And now for one of the last parts, prioritizing, right? How do I test my assets and what to prioritize first? As I've said before, you need to test your assets according to your security policy. Sometimes there are vendors doing that for you. Sometimes you have products doing that for you. Sometimes you do it yourself. Sometimes it's a mixture of all of those. But ideally, you cannot test all your assets 100% on a daily basis. It's not that efficient anyway. So you need to prioritize. What do you want to test first, and what do you want to validate first and fix first, right? Because you can have 90% of your assets incompliant, but what do you fix first? What do you remediate first? So the first part is very important. Is it alive or not? Because obviously, if I have a machine that is super vulnerable in the configuration, I'm looking at the configuration, the machine looks super vulnerable, the firewall is open, and whatever, I don't know, it's horrible, but it's not alive. Someone closed the machine, right? Someone shut it down. It's less important than a similar machine that is alive, right? The second part is it attractive to anyone? Is it hosting anything, right? So obviously, when you're looking at an asset that only answers ICMP requests, ping, whatever, usually it's not as attractive to attackers than an asset that is hosting a MySQL server, right? Again, relatively, but we know that hackers love databases generally. So maybe this is something to have in mind. How attractive is an asset according to world data? Third part is, are there any security gaps on this asset? Is it not compliant with my security policy? And again, this is also an internal prioritization, because security gaps can be, my SSL certificate is about to be expired in a week, which is a security gap or about to be a security gap, but it's not as bad as I have a CVE that is super critical and it has a 10 CVSS score and the database that is exposed on this asset, right? It sounds more, incompliant and more risky than the other. And the last part, which is super interesting, and not everyone is thinking about it, but are those security gaps exploitable? Let's assume that we have two assets, and two of those have similar services with a CVSS score of 10. Critical, right? These are big risks. But only one of those CVEs, one of those assets, has been exploited in the wild, and there is an actual exploit code available for, random people online. So this is probably more exploitable than the first one. It's not 100% exploitable and zero exploitable. There are gray areas, right? But generally, you should be aware of what's more exploitable and what's less exploitable. And you need to be aware of that, because it also helps prioritize things. Because 1 to 3 can leave you with a list that is relatively long, but number 4 should leave you with a list that is much shorter and helps you focus on the right stuff first. And the last part, again, iterate, because everything written above here will change quite often, specifically in cloud environments, which are very volatile and very prone to constant changes, either in IP addresses, either in new vulnerabilities, either in just people messing around with that, because a lot of people don't really know how to manage cloud like they knew how to manage on-premise. So again, very important. How do you migrate assets securely? So last slide, you had your status, right? Sometimes you can quantify your security posture. I don't know, my risk is G, or my risk is D, or my risk is 25. I don't know, but you need to understand what's your current situation. And then you need to compare it with the next iteration, and the next iteration, and the previous iteration. And then you have deltas. Sometimes the deltas are positive, meaning that I had a grade of 85, and now I have a grade of 87. in a scale that 100 is super secure and 0 is not secure at all. So I had 85 and now I have 87. This means that I'm better. Obviously, there may be some differences in some specific assets that are less secure, but generally as an environment, I am more secure right now. So I need to still make sure that I'm understanding what's happening. But generally speaking, when your risk score is starting to get worse, you need to start investigating and understand exactly how is the difference, how is it happening, why is it happening. You need to investigate and you need to take action. This is very important because obviously if you look at your risk being lower and lower, and you're messing around with policies, that's not good. You need to investigate. You need to make sure that you're proactive. And this is something that I found to be very, very intriguing. And one last thing that I did want to talk about, what does the future hold for cloud visibility, right? So you have general guidelines for some kind of cloud visibility plan, which is great. But what's going to happen in a year or 5 years from today? So sadly, I'm not a psychic. I have no idea. But I can guess. And my guess, I assume that there will be more risks because there will be more interesting services. This will also mean that there will be a lower visibility. It will be harder to keep track of all the new technologies and new services and such. And that's fun. Hooray! Like more risk, lower visibility. This means more cybersecurity people in the industry, hopefully. So these are my 2 cents about cloud visibility in the near future. And that's basically it. So first of all, thank you very much for listening. This is a short Q&A session. We have a few minutes left, I assume. And Brian, do we have any questions, anything specific that someone wanted to ask?
We do. And thank you, Aviel, for an excellent presentation. Looks like we have some questions from the audience, so I'll jump into those now. The first question is, why do companies move towards shadow IT / encouraging their employees to create unmanaged assets in the cloud when they know they do not have visibility into or protection for these assets?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think that the main reason for that is that security managers today are more business oriented than they were in the past. They're not preventing the business from working. They're being flexible while maintaining security level. And sometimes it does mean that you need to embrace things like shadow IT. Obviously, manageable, right? You can't have 90% of your IT being unmanaged shadow IT that no one knows about, but you will have shadow IT. It is a fact. So you need to embrace it, and you need to make sure that the people that are usually more prone to do that are aware of what they're doing, and they report it to you, and it makes sense. And you need to make sure that they're not afraid. They need to be cooperative, and obviously, maybe there's a reason why they do that. So they need to make sure that there's someone to talk to. And I think that embracing it is better than preventing the business from working, because no one is creating random machines just for the sake of doing that. They need something. They need to work. This is their job. So this is what I think. This is kind of like the transformation of security from being blocking the business to working with the business at some level. So yeah, that's my 2 cents about that.
Thank you. Thank you for the explanation. The next question is, how does managing external risk for cloud-based assets differ from CSPM?
That's an interesting question. So I would start with mentioning that CSPM is very oriented towards cloud, which is obviously great because it is a cloud security posture management tool. But the problem is that it doesn't see the entire picture, right? Most of the CSPM vendors today are working in an environment that, they're either collaborating or a part of a bigger product suite that looks in a holistic way. And that is what I'm aiming to do, right? So CSPM is a standalone product, cannot see what's happening from the outside. Therefore, I think that their prioritization just can't be realistic, because when you're prioritizing risk, you're thinking about, again, most of the time you're thinking about external risk because you're afraid that someone will hack you from the outside. Internal risk, again, is relatively lower in terms of things that CISOs are afraid of. That's why I think that external visibility is something that makes more sense. But I do think that it's actually not kind of like pros and cons. It's actually the collaboration between products like CSPMs that can look at your configuration and your architecture and your configuration of specific services and instances together with the external view. And this is actually something that I would really encourage companies to have, both of them collaborating together and providing you with the holistic picture. Yeah, I hope this makes sense.
It does. Thank you. Thank you for the explanation on that as well. The next question is, what are some necessary checkpoints when creating security policies for internet-facing assets built in the cloud?
Yeah, so that's a tough question because I think it really varies between different industries, different companies and such. I think that kind of like, I can think of the baseline of obviously, making sure that you're working with allow lists, for example, meaning that everything you do should be allowed instead of blocked, meaning you need to block everything unless someone specifically allows that. It can be either in network rules, it can be either in configuration, it can be in everything else. The second thing that is very interesting is making sure that whatever you do, make sure that it helps the business and is transparent to the business, because obviously when you're interrupting the business, people try to manipulate and kind of like be flexible around security and maybe not talk about it and maybe not do it because it's hurting the business. So whenever you have a security policy, make sure that it aligns with the business and it helps the business grow while keeping it secure. Those are two checkpoints that I think are very important and not super security oriented, because obviously I can't go into the tactical steps. So yeah, those are my two, I'd say, areas that I would start with.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next question is, which aspects of a cloud-based asset are most attractive to threat actors? How can I make sure to prioritize these types of assets in my security policies?
That's a good question. I think it really depends. So one thing that I know is very interesting to attackers, and again, it really depends, but I would start with kind of like understanding what's the motive. So if the motive is money, for example, I would say that stealing data is something that is very valuable in terms of money. So for example, databases, buckets, and things that store data, maybe even personal data, maybe even confidential data. These are things that I would worry about in terms of motivation for money. Specifically when talking about something that is more dedicated, like country level espionage and such, those are things that are very hard to predict because these are people that dedicate their lives to finding security gaps and vulnerabilities and such, and it's very hard. I do think that the best advice and best thing that I can say is just follow the advisories. There are CISA advisories, NIST advisories and such. Just follow them and make sure that you can align with them and understand what they mean and what they do and who's monitoring what. So that's my view around that one.
Okay, great. Thank you. And the last question we have is, can I create new assets that comport with my security policies from the date they are launched?
Yes, definitely. It's obviously not 100% compliant with everything, but most cloud vendors today, and maybe even all of them, allow you to have a dedicated template for different services, let's say virtual machines and instances, APIs, gateways, and such. So you can have a default configuration that you cannot run from, right? So you install a new machine, you have to install it from template. Obviously, again, it's never 100% correct, but sometimes it's more than enough in order to cover, the 80 or 90%. So yeah, this is something that is very much applicable. There are even external products that help you with that, but I think that the most of the cloud providers today have this capability in-house, and it's very good. So I would say that this is the best opportunity in terms of that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, that's all the questions that we have for today's session. And I just want to thank you, Aviel, for this excellent presentation. And thank you to the audience for your thoughtful questions. And we'll see you at the next webinar in our series. And hope everyone has a great rest of the day and a great weekend.
Thank you. Have a great week or weekend, actually.
That's right. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
We'll see you next time. Cheers.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.